Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of the Monsters Den. Today, we've got in the co-captain's chair, Mr. Dan Brown from the warehouse in Newburgh, New York. What's happening, Dan?
Nothing much, Peter. All excited about this evening's show.
This
Everything
evening's
other than
festivities.
Universal.
Yeah, so we're basically going to be talking about our favorite 10 films from the kind of the 30s and the 40s that are not a Universal film, right? So non-Universal horror classics from what many consider the golden age of horror, kind of when it all started. So this was I guess it was somewhat tricky to put them in some sort of order, and I don't even know really if my order is. I don't know how much I care about my order, but I think I have my 10 favorites here. It was kind of tough. There's a handful that I left out that I'll talk about at the end, but I think I'm pretty good with what I have here. So there's some good stuff, and funny enough, a lot of the same actors appear in like most of these films for the good part of it.
Yeah, I had a hard time narrowing it down to 10 because I started like 20, then I go to 15, then finally got to 10, and I started watching some more stuff, and something that was number 8 was now number 6. It's just it's very stressful. They don't realize how much work goes into this.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving and shaking going on. I
But
know.
it's a lot of fun. You get to revisit a lot of stuff. So I'm actually happy with it. So,
Oh
and
yeah,
I'm realizing I need to upgrade to Blu-ray because I'm looking at some of my DVD copies of things, and I'm kind of surprised how bad the prints are
yeah.
on certain ones. And I'm going like, okay, if it comes out on Blu-ray, I may have to sit and get this. But they really took some crummy prints on some of the films they put it on DVD.
They did, and I'm looking at my stack here, and I think probably 60% of them I have on Blu-ray, and the others are still DVDs. And yeah, the quality of them is not very good. And I keep looking to see when they're going to release some of
Yeah.
these on Blu-ray, and there's like nothing planned. It's just like, oh, like there's a couple in particular that really stand out like a sore thumb. Like, what are they waiting for here? And we'll get to them. So I'll have Dan kick us off with his, I guess, number 10 here.
Number 10. Okay, I'm going to start off with if you think about 1940s horror films, the name Val Lewton cannot be ignored. Independent producer that came over to RKO, actually started with David O. Selznick. And my number 10 film is something he made in 1943 that was kind of topical. It also did not do well at the box office, and that's a film called The Seventh Victim.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's a very interesting little film, and it's one of the, although they had done films about devil worshiping, or let's say devil cults or satanic cults, they were pretty straightforward in your face, such as The Black Cat with Karloff with his Art Deco clothing and such, and the crosses, and other films in the silent are like The Magician or even Seven Footprints to Satan. This one here has the air of Rosemary's Baby without the black bassinet and without Mia Farrow. It takes place in the basic gist of the story is Kim Hunter is going to boarding school in her first film. She is known well in the genre of the show here tonight as playing Zira, Cornelius's wife in 3 Planet of the Apes films.
Yep.
And she finds out that her tuition is not going to be paid at her private school by her sister, who is kind of a trend-setting, works in a cosmetic perfume company, a trendy one in New York City. And she feels it's more important to go find her sister. And when she gets herself to New York, she finds herself in Greenwich Village, meeting not only her sister who has disappeared, her sister's husband, a lover, her psychiatrist, and you eventually start stumbling upon that there is actually a satanic worshiping cult, and she's been kind of sucked into it somehow. No big scares, no monsters running down the hall, typical Val Lewton, shadows, fear of the unknown. Failed miserably when it came out, got a lot of criticism. It was very big in England and in France, and as a matter of fact, it has been noted in the film of history for film that is actually the first film noir, because it's really a mystery, and the French deemed it noir. And it started getting an audience in the late 60s. It's developed a great deal of respect over the years. It's a slow burner, but it's got all those Val Lewton nuances, and it's worth a look-see to see it. And last bit of trivia about it, the character of Tom Conway in the film, who was in the film Curse of the Cat People, plays a psychiatrist with the same name. And people have noted that possibly Seventh Victim was before the Cat People film, but he plays the same character and a psychiatrist. So there you go. But Seventh Victim, 1943, worth a look-see.
Yeah, all those Luton films are very kind of atmospheric, and they have a certain feel to them. They're not as big on the scares as some of the other films we might talk about, and it was never about blood or violence or any of that kind of stuff, and everything was implied, right? But yeah, all really well-made films, and they look pretty good when you think about it, right? Yeah. All right, my number 10, I'm going to go 1933, starring none other than Mr. Boris Karloff, The Ghoul. I know you're a fan of this one right here. So, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting film, and it's amazing how, in a weird way, kind of similar to The Mummy, right? I mean, it's almost as if, and The Mummy came out right also around the same time. And interesting tale of like treasures and the afterlife, eternal life, and all that sort of stuff. And Karloff's character, it's interesting because if you've seen this film for the first time, you'd be thinking like right in the beginning, that's like, oh, okay, they killed off Karloff's character right in the beginning, but wait, he comes back later in the film to kind of wreak havoc. And it's all about the ancient what is it called here? So the Egyptology, right? So it's all about the ancient Egypt artifacts and being able to give you eternal life and all that sort of stuff. And of course, he finds these artifacts and he is like consumed with wanting to see if that actually works, right? But of course, when you come back, maybe not exactly as you'd like to come back, right? So I think for me, the first half of the film is kind of moody and kind of moves along. It's kind of slow, but then the whole second half, when he does come back and he starts his rampage, that's Karloff at his best, because all of a sudden he's this kind of mindless, ravenous beast, roaming across the countryside, and you can see picture right there, right? Really cool film, and again, I think it kind of gets lost in those early 30s classics of other films that came out around it, like Frankenstein, like The Mummy, like Dracula, and a few others, which we'll probably talk about. This film kind of gets overlooked, but I think it's one of the early gems of the 30s, and also especially of Karloff's filmography. So, big fan.
And it's funny you mentioned it's lost, because that film was lost until the 1980s, and they found a copy of it behind the Iron Curtain.
Wow.
And for the longest time in the 80s, the only way to get it had, I think it was something like, it had particular subtitles on it. And they found it in the 1980s. They eventually found a greater print of it. And he made he made that film when he went back to England. It was his triumphant return to his homeland. In the early 30s, he returned to England after like struggling as an actor. He finally attained stardom. And there's this great photograph of Karloff with his three other brothers, the other brothers, who were all members of like government service, like ambassadors and stuff. And here's the black sheep of the family coming back. And it's a very funny picture, because he's sitting like grinning, like happy as a clam. And his three brothers have that stiff upper lip look, like, oh, it's just Boris, or whatever, Richard, or his name was, Henry Pratt. But it's kind of funny, made on a triumphant return.
A good flick. All right, what do you got? Number 9.
Me, number 9. Well, I'm going to go with Warner Brothers this time. And it's going to be the 1933 version of Mystery of the Wax Museum. 2-strip Technicolor. A film that stars not only Lionel Atwill, everybody's favorite mad doctor over the years, and actually a very accredited actor in many things, but it's also one of the 4 appearances that Fay Wray made as the original Scream Queen. Remade in the 1950s as House of Wax, with Vincent Price and Charles Bronson, of all people. But it comes off well. The story, I think everybody and their brother is pretty much familiar with the story. I mean, person who has a wax museum, and I think it's in England. He has a partner who in turn they're not making money. They get into a big fight. Let's get the insurance money. The place burns down. X amount of years later, he shows up in New York in a wheelchair, a bit probably brain damaged or demented, with revenge on his mind and the way he's making his, I don't want to ruin for anybody, how he's making his statuaries. But very well done. I said early 2-strip Technicolor, restored it a while ago. Great print floating around. Is available on Blu-ray. And yeah, I just like that film. And it's just the pacing of it, the story, and there you go.
Yeah, it's a good one. More about that in a few minutes. But I also just realized that they released it on Blu-ray, so I just that's sitting in my Amazon cart, waiting for the next time I place an order. So that will be coming to my house pretty soon. But and it's amazing how really similar Mystery of the Wax Museum and House of Wax are. I mean, literally, they're at some points almost scene for scene. They're identical for the most part. Very, very similar. Well, the climax is a bit different in both, but yeah, Atwell does a great job in that film. He's an underrated actor when we talk about a lot of these old time greats, right? You know, you talk about Karloff and Lugosi and Price and Cushing and Lee and all these guys. I mean, Atwell was not only a great evil scientist, he played a great kind of kooky policeman, and you know all sorts of other things. Yeah, he's
And even in his non-horror roles, he always adds a certain level of class or panache. I mean,
yeah.
he ended up. I mean, I'll be talking about Atwell a little bit later as well, but he kind of ended up having his career end in a pretty sour note, and I'll touch upon that maybe later. But yeah, great underrated actor in the big scheme of things, but probably everyone's favorite. Probably played, other than Karloff, probably played a mad doctor more than anybody else.
Yeah, you might be right. You might be right. It'd be interesting to do the math on that, right?
We'll say, I'll do a spreadsheet. You know.
There you go. There you go. All right, my number 9. I'm going to go up a couple years to 1935. My man Bela Lugosi, Mark of the Vampire. This is included in this DVD collection, Legends of Horror, with all sorts of other cool stuff here. You got, Boris Karloff film, Mask of Fu Manchu. That's not the one we're talking about today, but yeah, Mark of the Vampire. So, you know, very notable for being the return of Bela as a vampire, which of course, you know, he played Dracula, and then he was, you know, on the outs before you know it with Universal. So they decided to make this film. This was with Warner Brothers, right? Yeah, and a really cool film, a really atmospheric film. I mean, there's a scene in here with with his character, the vampire. He's not Dracula, obviously. They can't use the name, and like his daughter. I think the scene where you first see her and she kind of like floats down. I mean, it's creepy as all hell, and it rivals, I think, any of those really early creepy scenes from the original Dracula film. But the film is kind of polarizing because of the ending. And I'm not going to spoil it for people who have not watched it, but and this is basically a remake of London After Midnight, which was an old silent classic with Lon Chaney Sr., which has been lost. So that is one of those, probably everybody has seen the stills from that film, and Chaney with the great vampire makeup and the top hat and the fangs, supposedly one of his best films, but there is nothing left of that original print or any other prints. And so that's unfortunately one of the catastrophes of the early silent horror era. But Mark of the Vampire was a remake of that story. And basically, it's one of those films where it's like, don't believe everything you see in the film because the end might kind of shock you. And I'm not going to say any more, but for a lot of people, the ending has ruined the rest of the film for them. I'm not one of those. I think that the rest of the film is strong enough, and I think Lugosi's great, obviously, in this character, and I think he has plenty to work with here. But I think the one who steals the film is, and I forget her name, but the one who plays his daughter. There's actually a cool interview here with her many years later, and she talks about how cool it was, you know, working with Bela Lugosi back then and all that. So pretty cool film. I still like it. Again, there's not, for a guy who was known for playing Dracula and a classic vampire, there are not a lot of films with Bela playing a vampire. So you got to treasure all the ones that he's in. I think this is a good one.
Yeah, I like it because it's atmospheric as hell.
Oh,
I mean, it's
totally.
just the opening sequences, a great cast. I mean, once again, Lionel Atwell's in it.
Yep.
Lionel Barrymore, Jean
Yes.
Herschel, and the young lady is actress by the name of Carol Borland,
Okay.
who was kind of, I believe she did stage work with Lugosi, and that's how she got the role. but it's a really creepy film. And yes, it is a remake of London. That's why when people say London After Midnight is supposed to be a magnificent, is the myth of London After Midnight far surpasses probably the reality, probably because it's lost.
Yeah.
Because so if anyone wants to know what London After Midnight was, there are some changes, and it's also directed by Tom Browning as well, the same director from London. I think if they found London After Midnight, they would be disappointed. There are some other films that Chaney made, in particular one called A Blind Bargain from 1920, in which he plays like this hunchbacked ape man. And that's totally lost. But nonetheless, I like that film, love the atmospherics, especially the opening sequences.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Quite good. Quite good. All right. Back to you.
Back to me. Okay. Number 8. Well, I'm back at Warner Brothers again, and another 2-strip Technicolor, and another Fay Wray film, and another Lionel Atwill film. And we got Preston Foster. And that's called Dr. X.
Oh, yeah. Good one.
Now, Dr. X, I mean, that to me, that's one of the, and there's some interesting stories about Dr. X, but Dr. X is, you've got a institution or somewhere, a doctor or a scientist by playing, not Dr. Xavier, I think he's Dr. Xavier in the film. Well, he runs this research institute, and he has all of these different scientists there. And his daughter is Fay Wray. But there's been some mysterious murders going on in the city, in downtown New York. And in particular, and the ever-loving Lee Tracy plays this snappy patter reporter who is trying to uncover this whole thing. And these murders go on. There's not going to give anything away about it. Let's just say it works with something called synthetic skin, because the monster is viewed as some horrible, horrible creature. And you never see him until the end. There's even a sequence, I think, and I didn't get a chance to watch it again. There's a sequence that's very similar to when they test everybody in The Thing, where they have everybody tied to chairs. And that's when the whole culmination comes. Interesting about Dr. X, once again, that's available on Blu-ray. But for many years, the color version was lost. They didn't find the color version until the late 1970s, when they found a private print in Jack Warner's archive in his own home after he passed away. But up until that point, they only had a black and white print existed. And the black and white prints were made for towns that did not have the facility nor the money to play color films. Color films were made for the big cities. Same thing happened with silent and sound. But however, the black and white print was done by a different director, and it has slightly different camera angles and shots. So the thing is, if you buy the Blu-ray version, which is available, you get both prints. And although they saved the film in late 1970, early 80s, putting out safety stock, they did a full-blown restoration in 2019, and it looks stunning, stunning. Now, in a bit comical relief and comical sense of the word, Lee Tracy, who plays the reporter in the film, he was like everyone's favorite reporter actor, or he worked for a newspaper. Well, he was cast in a film in 1934 called Viva Villa with Wallace Beery, in which he plays an American reporter covering Pancho Villa's, his campaign. Well, in those days, people drank a lot. People got silly. And he ended up standing on the top of a hotel, and he decided to urinate off the side of the building, off the top of the roof. And he ended up peeing on some military people. He ended up getting kicked out of Mexico, and it kind of blacklisted his career. He was replaced on the film. And it wasn't until the 1950s he went to doing B films, and he eventually made kind of a comeback in the 1950s. But yeah, he was blacklisted for his drunken antics in Mexico. But that's just a bit of funny trivia. That's it. So that's my choice, Dr. X, available on Blu-ray, and it's worth to get 2 films for the price of 1.
Yep, there you go. Yep, and it's like I was shown before, also available in this Legends of Horror DVD set for those of you who don't have that as well and you don't care about the Blu-ray. Yeah, good collection there. All right, my number 8, 1939. This for me is one of the underrated Lugosi gems in this time period, and I'd say it's not always labeled as a horror film. It's more like a thriller mystery, but there's enough elements of horror in here. Specifically, I think his portrayal of the character. The Human Monster, okay, which also went by another name of which that is escaping me, something London, right? I forget what the
Dead Eyes of London.
Dead Eyes of London. That's right. Now that I believe was the name of the story, the book, right? Yeah, this is a pretty twisted tale, and there is kind of this monster character in here. He's kind of like this deaf and blind mute guy who's like deformed, and he's big and he looks really ugly, and he kind of is doing like Lugosi's bidding. Lugosi's like this evil and twisted, almost like insurance broker, right? Who is secretly killing a lot of people who have these big insurance policies, and he's got this whole like kind of like not like an underground. He's got this like warehouse where all these like bums are staying and people. It's a crazy film, but his character is so over the top evil in this film. I mean, this is like, I'm trying to compare this to another kind of like his character in The Raven, how like twisted and evil, and how he's just, Bella is just totally getting into the role. I mean, that's what you get here. And there's a scene where he's, with the female lead in the film, who her name also Greta Gint, I believe, late in the film, where he's got her captive, and he's just like, he's just basically saying, I'm going to torture you and I'm going to love it, and then we're going to throw you in the river. And it's so over the top Bela Lugosi, and it's just, and the close-up of his eyes. I mean, that is like a one constant with a lot of these early Bela Lugosi classics. It's like the directors always did that kind of real close-up of his eyes, and that they kind of hone in on this here. But such a great performance, an underrated performance. This, I think, for me is a top 5 performance from him, because he's just, again, the movie's not an out and out horror film, but there's enough horrific elements, and there's people dying in this film, and torture going on in this film. So I think it's included here. I think it totally deserves to be here. But just really good. If you haven't seen it, The Human Monster just came out on Blu-ray not long ago. You can also get some really crappy DVD copies, which I don't recommend you do because they're awful. But this is at least a little bit better. So yeah, but it's an unknown underground classic, again, 1939. So again, these are during his years where he was away from Universal, just basically taking whatever roles he could possibly get. But this is a good one. This is a well-made movie. It's well acted. It's pretty suspenseful, and like I said, his performance is chilling, to say the least.
And I'd like to add, he plays like a Kaiser Soze character, because all the bums that are in the warehouse, it's a house of the blind.
Yeah.
And he plays during the day this benevolent man who runs it, and he has glasses on, but meanwhile he takes those glasses off. Yeah. And that's why the big killer is blind also. Jake, I think his name is.
Yeah.
Interesting thing about it, it's written by Edgar Wallace. Edgar Wallace is considered one of the most prolific crime mystery novelists of the last century. He also is the writer of King Kong. But it's a great film. It's a great film.
Yeah. I remember the first time I saw it, and it was only a few years ago. I was like, how did I never see this before? I mean, this is like, and I'm a big Lugosi fan. So I was like, this is one of his best performances. I love it. I mean, it's so deliciously evil. It's like, how can you not, great.
Chews up the scenery.
He does. He does.
So next up for me, it's number 7. Well, from the director of Mark of the Vampire, from Lon Chaney's right-hand man making movies in the 20s. This is the film that got him kind of 86 from Hollywood, or kind of ruined his career. And that's Todd Browning, and that's 1932's Freaks, which is a disturbing film.
Yeah.
On many levels. It's based on a short story called Spurs. And the funny thing about Freaks is that it was banned in the U.S. until like the late 60s, early 70s. And I happened to catch on a midnight showing with Night of the Living Dead. So talk about a 13-year-old, 14-year-old having a 1-2 punch of things you weren't used to seeing. But Freaks is just, it's disturbing. It's a basic, and it boils around sideshow oddities. And Browning was always enamored. He was in the sideshow. He worked in circuses and sideshows and as a barker and such. So he was always kind of attached to that. And even when he did The Unknown with Lon Chaney Sr., where he had no arms, he was a knife thrower, and any number of things. There's always clowns and weird stuff. But Freaks, you're basically talking about, the freaks, although they are kind of ostracized by society, they have a code of their own. And if you break that code or you try to hurt them, there's nothing beyond their realm of revenge, what they'll do. And the ending is extremely disturbing. I don't want to ruin it if anyone's ever seen it. Lon Chaney had actually done a test makeup for a particular person at the end of the movie, but they didn't use it. He was dead, of course. But Freaks, right up there. It's hard to explain. I don't want to give too much away about it, except they use actual real sideshow oddities and freaks, if you want to call it, or I don't even know what the word is. You can't use the word freaks anymore. Yet I've said it 4 times tonight. So yeah, we'll be getting the letters tomorrow. But anyhow, Freaks, cannot pass it up. It is available. I don't know if it's on Blu-ray. It's not going to make it less disturbing, but it is available on DVD in a number of different ways. You can find it.
Yeah, I had that on VHS back in the day. I never replaced it on DVD or anything else because it's a bizarre little movie. It's like it's almost like I don't know if he intended it to be as like disturbing as it actually is, but it is.
The Ramones based, there's one scene where they're the marriage of the midget and the aerialist or whatever it is, the woman and thing, where they're singing a song, "We Will Make You One of Us." That was the Ramones use that. They were big fans. Joey Ramone and them were fans of that film, and that's why they had the pinhead masks and such. And there's a lot of people out there that probably will not admit they're fans of that film unless they're a private company or behind closed doors. But it has a special, you got to give Browning credit. It was pre-code, everything was off the table. And let me tell you, he said, "I'm just going to go for it." And they all sat there slack-jawed at the studios going like, what do we do with this?
Yeah, can you imagine being a part of that movie, that meeting? Jeez.
Oh, man, that's at the screening, total silence. So anyhow, but that's my Freaks. You go ahead. I just have to get something. I'll be right back.
Excuse me. You got it. So my number 7 is actually going to be one that Dan already picked, and that's Mystery of the Wax Museum from 1933. Really good film. Really good film. And like we mentioned before, I think Dan, kind of laid it out pretty perfectly. Just a really cool story that's, been done many times afterwards, but basically you got, these 2 partners in this wax museum. The one guy wants to get out. He's tired of it, wants to collect the insurance money. So let's burn the thing down. And his partner, of course, Lionel Atwill, gets caught in the fire, gets disfigured, shows up many months later. And, we've gone over the story before. It's a really good one. I'm a big fan of the first Mystery of the Wax Museum. But again, it's one of those stories that has had numerous remakes over the years. It's amazing when you look at how many times that story has been redone and remade and reimagined over the years. But the first one, I would say Mystery of the Wax Museum and House of Wax, the follow-up with Vincent Price, easily the best out of all the ones that have been made. Both very similar, both very chilling. And number 7, Mystery of the Wax Museum for me.
I'm ready with number 6.
All right.
Number 6. Return of the Vampire, Lugosi, 1943. Columbia Pictures. Just a well done atmospheric. I think it's 68 minutes.
Yeah, it's not long at all.
Yeah, and it has a prologue which takes place in World War I with a vampire by the name of Armand Tesla. Then it goes. There's something that happens, and then it kind of jumps to World War II. And a lot of it has to do with like the bombings of London and the Nazis, and there's no Nazis in it, but it's a wartime film. It's got everything in there. First, you got Lugosi playing a vampire, complete with tucks and tails. And he doesn't have a fly munching Renfield, there you go, or nor does he have, any other crazy as an assistant like Igor, whatever. He's got a werewolf, a little familiar minion played by Matt Willis. And the interesting thing about why Return of the Vampire, and it's a nice, smoothly moving little film. Why I find Return of the Vampire so interesting as a picture overall is, number one, yes, the atmospherics, the whole World War II topical thing. But it really is. People like to say that Lugosi's last shining moment was Abbott and Costello Frankenstein. And yes, it was. But in fact, he played second banana to Bud and Lou, and he also was part of a entourage of three other monsters. This is his last starring role in a film
Yeah.
from a somewhat major studio, although Columbia was not the biggest studio. And so he really shines in this. And it's kind of ironic that he goes from Dracula in 31 and his final great note. Not that I don't like Bride of the Monster by Ed Wood, don't get me wrong, but this film is a grand send-off for him, and he relishes it, and he actually has the top billing. Now, the interesting thing about this film, a bit of trivia I've unearthed about this, is that somewhere along the line, at this point in 43, Universal was at its power with its second run of the monster films. And Columbia, after they cast Lugosi, although Universal had no interest in casting Lugosi whatsoever in anything at that point, okay, they wrote either a nasty letter or they threatened a lawsuit against Columbia, thinking they were stealing their character of Dracula. Now, Columbia had jumped onto the horror bandwagon in 1939 when they signed Karloff to 5 films, the Mad Doctor cycle. And by the 1940s, and Harry Cohn was not beyond this. Hey, let's do what they're doing, cheaper, better, and faster, and make money. We'll get this guy Lugosi. You can buy him lunch, he'll play a role.
Yeah.
And, they did this. And it turned around and they had, so I don't know what happened, but they were supposed to make a werewolf movie based on Matt Willis's makeup. And yes, they did make a werewolf movie called Cry of the Werewolf, but it's a far shallower film. So Universal must have scared them a little bit legally, and they backed off. But I think they did. I think Columbia or Allied Artists made that film called The Werewolf in 1956 with similar makeup. And by then, Harry Cohn was dead. All the powers that be were dead. Universal was now Universal International, and they were busy making sci-fi movies. They could care less at that point about their monsters. But in the mid-40s, they controlled it, and they control it to this day. But anyhow, that's the trivia part. But yeah, Return of the Vampire, love that film from beginning to end, and nothing better than a talking dog assistant, whatever.
And Andreas.
Andreas, that's correct. That's great. Yes, master.
Yeah. More about that in a couple minutes. I'm a fan of that as well.
Okay.
So my number 6 from 1932. We talk about freaks, how disturbing that is. This is also a pretty disturbing film too. Island of Lost Souls, which of course is based on a novel by H.G. Wells. Chilling film. Once again, we got Mr. Lugosi here as well. In addition to a very, very awesome Charles Lawton in perhaps my favorite role for him. You talk about just a really good actor playing a not very good guy. That is this. So basically Lawton is he's like this kind of scientist out on this island. He's doing all these experiments with, small animals and mixing, animal blood or DNA with humans and making these kind of mutated creatures that are, it's what, pigs and mice and possums and all these other animals that happen to habitate on the island. All of a sudden you've got these kind of werewolf looking creatures who, if they don't do what they're told by Lawton, their creator, they go to the house of pain, right? Which is the famous line in the film. And it's you really feel for these creatures because they didn't want to be put into this position. They didn't want to be made into these, horrible creatures. And it's just, it's a really interesting film. You got these people who come from the mainland, who come to the island, of course, to kind of see what's going on. Lawton doesn't want them there. And then it's the whole movie is watching Lawton's character slowly lose his grip on reality. And, the power that he has over these creatures just kind of gets the best of him. And then I'm not going to give away the end, but obviously you can imagine it doesn't really turn out too well for him. It's a very short film. It's only about 70 minutes long. And this is the Criterion Collection Blu-ray, which is probably as good as you're ever going to see it, because this film just hasn't aged too well. So the original source material it's pretty beat up, but this is as good as it's going to get. It's a really, really cool, chilling film, and the last half hour is pretty intense. So.
I'm a big fan of that film as well. I'll be talking about that later.
There you go. Figured as much.
Next up for me, Peter Lorre's first American film, 1935, Mad Love, aka known as the Hands of Warlock, which was made in the silent era. There you go, with Conrad Veidt. And interesting story, a concert pianist played by the ever tortured, both on movies and in personal life, Colin Clive, plays a concert pianist whose hands are horribly crushed in an accident. Well, what they're going to do is they are going to be executing a strangler or a mass murderer or serial killer. They don't refer to him as that. And he is convinced by, I think it's Dr. or what is it? It's not Dr. Orlock. I can't remember what Peter's Lorre's name is, but he's a doctor, and he's going to do this operation where he's going to replace Colin Clive's hands with the hands of the strangler. And somewhere it becomes a psychological play where they're trying to convince Colin Clive that he is killing people because he has a strangler's hands. MGM, great cast. Ted Healy, who was, once a member of the Three Stooges entourage, who died tragically in the 1930s. I think Key Luke even has a part in the film. I'm not sure, but also Edward Brophy, who plays the Strangler Lewis or something. He was a Warner Brothers stock player. Peter Lorre is just this sexually obsessed, looks like Uncle Fester. Yeah. Crazy story. And Colin Clive is even more tormented than he was in any other film he'd ever done. One scene where Colin Clive meets supposedly the man whose hands he has, and he goes into this room, and there's this guy that has kind of like he's kind of like a combination from the neck up, the Invisible Man, with all his head wrapped up and steampunk goggles, and he has these huge like T-1000 Terminator hands that they replaced him with. It's just pretty wild. Interesting little anecdote. I know on one of the Universal shows I was on, I had mentioned about how my wife's family is related to like Turhan Bey and a number from Universal. A funny little story is that Peter Lorre was a personal friend of my father-in-law's family, going back to the 1920s in theater and stage. And a family story or family myth, which was actually validated by somebody else in the family, was that, as you know, Peter Lorre had a very, very bad drug problem his entire life. And in 1932 or 33, when everybody was leaving the country that felt they were threatened by Hitler, Peter Lorre owed a lot of money to one of his pharmacists. And my wife's grandparents paid the debt and got him to England.
Wow.
And then he eventually went in to do The Man Who Knew Too Much. And to this day, I have an autograph that was given to my father-in-law that says, "From one Peter to another Peter, Peter Lorre." And but that's just a little bit of family history on my wife's side. So just thought I'd bring that in.
Yeah, and he's real creepy in that film. You almost wish he did more stuff like that.
And he has a wax figure. He's obsessed with something without giving it away.
Yeah.
Definitely worth watching.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. Good choice. All right, where are we? Number 5, right? All right, so I'm going to go into the 40s for the first time today, and we talked about Val Lewton before. This is probably my favorite Val Lewton film, and it's also one of the probably most notable Karloff films, and that's The Body Snatcher, Robert Louis Stevenson. Also, co-starring, I don't know if you want to call him a full co-star because he's not in the film all that long, but Bela Lugosi's in here as well. And this is, again, another one of those kind of stories, fables, tales that we've heard before about grave robbing. So you've got like a professor here who's doing all these experiments and he needs fresh bodies. So of course he goes and hires this thug, this not very good guy. And that's Boris Karloff's character to basically, rob graves for him, bring him cadavers so he can do what he needs to do. And obviously as time goes on in the film and, early on, Bela Lugosi's kind of helping Karloff's character. I'm not going to go into too much detail about kind of what happens to him, but as we get on the film, all of a sudden Karloff's character starts to get more and more confident in himself. And, he's like, well, I got a lot on you. What can I get out of this? That whole thing. And he's, we talk about not being a nice guy, man. Karloff's character is pretty evil in this. I mean, he is just not a good dude at all. Almost to the point where you start to feel a little sorry for the professor, even though he's the one who got all this shit started to begin with, right? But
he's a shithead, actually.
What's that?
Professor's a real shithead. He really is.
But
he's not a nice guy.
He's not at all, but you almost start to feel a little bad for him at some point in this film, right? Even though you shouldn't. So that's what's so great about this film, is because the filmmakers actually get you to feel that way for these characters. But Karloff is awesome. He's got his top hat, and he's just he's got that way of talking, which is just really good, and he's just always sneering, and it's a great performance by him. And again, one of those non-makeup performances it could be his best non-makeup performance, actually, I think. So the Body Snatcher, great story. Everybody's heard this story before, but man, this is a great film.
Okay, I'm up. This is number
four,
right? Number four. Well, Island of Lost Souls. Here we go. Yeah, just what you mentioned before. You pretty much hit all of the cylinders with that one. Other than what is the law? Not to eat meat, not to spill blood. I would have worn it tonight, but I actually have a T-shirt I designed. It's called Dr. Moreau's House of Pain, and it's got Charles Lawton in the middle. Maybe next time we have a show, I'll wear it if I could squeeze into an extra large. But yeah, one of my favorite films, done many, many times, including the 1996 Abomination by, who was it? Started with, Richard Stanley, who was a South African director, and then eventually got turned over to William Friedkin or somebody else. It was some, whatever. Was made originally in 1920 as a German silent film called, it's not called Island of Lost Souls, there's another name for it, but there was a minor version made in 1920 in the silent era. Doesn't carry the full impact, but the makeup is extraordinary. Lugosi, I mean, interesting how he got this part. I don't know if this is one of those things where they paid him a lot of money to come on there, but and for a man that didn't want to wear the makeup as Frankenstein, you can't even recognize him other than his voice.
Yeah, if you didn't utter a sound, you wouldn't even know it's him.
And but creepy as hell. Yeah, the ending is freaky. But yeah, I agree with that. And Island of Lost Souls is my number 4. Always have liked that film.
Do you remember who did the makeup on that? That was not Jack Pierce, correct?
I don't think so. I would like to say the Westmore. There might have been the Westmore brothers.
Yeah, it could be, because I think Jack was strictly working Universal.
Yeah, he had a contract with Universal.
Yeah.
See, Paramount really wasn't into horror that much. They made a couple of nice things, but Universal was one. When they lashed out of the horror, that was it.
Yeah, that's a good one. And if I remember correctly, I haven't watched it in a little bit. There's not a lot of music in that, right? There's not.
No, it's pretty quiet. Only the snapping of his whip, and and then there's also an interesting thing. The girl who plays the Panther Woman, she was named Kathleen Burke, and she was cast. They did a national contest, and they wanted to grab somebody that had kind of an exotic look to them and so forth. And that's how she was cast in the role. And yeah, that's like his, I think that's Dr. Moreau's, you find out early on, so it's not ruining it. That's Dr. Moreau's prize experiment, is the Panther one.
Yep. All right. My number 4, Dan has also mentioned recently, The Return of the Vampire from 1943. Also a big fan of this. It's ranking pretty high here. I like this quite a bit. And I think as someone who has loved these type of films for so many years and love like the Dracula or a vampire character and love werewolves, I love the fact that you've got the two of them interacting in this film. Even though, poor Andreas is no kind of substitute for Lon Chaney Jr. and his Wolfman, but I still think it's a really good film. I think Bella does a great job here. It's atmospheric, it's creepy. I love the one scene where they're out in the graveyard, which is totally awesome. And I like the ending a lot too. I think it's got a really good ending, with all of the bombs falling and all this kind of stuff. It's just really cool. A really good movie. And I think it holds up really well. And not a lot of people talk about this film. but I think you're absolutely correct. This is probably one of Lugosi's last great roles. And it doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion, because I think it's a really good one. And this should have been a Dracula film, I think. But even though the fact that it's not doesn't really matter, it doesn't diminish it at all. Really good. If you haven't checked it out, Return of the Vampire, amazing.
There's a great little comic relief with the two guys who are like, they have their little helmets on. They're out in the graveyard trying to see if the graves are disturbed, and they stumble upon and do something, and they're kind of like that slight comic relief, which is kind of in there.
Yeah. Yep.
Let's see. I'm next. Here we go. God, we're down to number 3, aren't we?
Yes.
God. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, this is interesting. Before I even preface to talk about this film, is that every studio had a specialty, which they did. Universal specialized in horror films. In the 40s, it was Deanna Derma musicals and Abbott and Costello. Paramount had all types of comedy stars, such as Mae West and W.C. Fields, the Marx Brothers, and did some other like comedy films and some other types. RKO just pretty much trudged along with little to no budget, did what they had to do. MGM had always a top-notch A productions. They were always considered more stars than there are in heaven. Columbia was known primarily for their Big Shorts division, which was the Three Stooges' home for 24 years. Well, you have Warner Brothers, and here's another Warner Brothers film. But Warner Brothers' specialty, other than Busby Berkeley musicals, was the social commentary film that dealt with things that were happening in the topical world, such as the Depression and such. And part of that was the gangster movie. And this had people like James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, Humphrey Bogart, all got their start there, playing thugs and gangsters. Well, in 1936, they did the perfect mashup, and including Karloff. And it's called The Walking Dead. No, not the TV show, but The Walking Dead. And it's an interesting because they perfectly mash up the gangster saga that they did so well with horror, and they pull it off very effectively. The gist of it all is, Karloff is kind of a lackey in the mob. The mobsters are going to get, the head of the mob is going to be convicted by a judge, and with the help of a corrupt lawyer, they kind of set Karloff up because Karloff had a beef with this judge, or this judge had sent him away. And they kind of set him up to take the fall for the judge's murder. While he's there, there's a benevolent scientist played by everybody's favorite Santa Claus from Miracle on 34th Street, Edmund Gwenn, who also, for all of our genre people here, was the professor in Them, as well as Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Yep. Well, he has this thing where he's going to bring people back to life. And, well, they managed to bring Karloff back to life. But he's just not right. He's not a gut-munching zombie. He walks with a limp, like he suffered some kind of a cerebral, like a stroke. He has a big white streak. Huh?
His hair looks different. Yeah.
Hair has a big white streak in his hair, and he has this totally dead look in his eye, and he can play some really groovy, otherworldly piano music because he sits into the world beyond. And it's so funny because the gangsters in the film are played by Warner Brothers stock companies, played by Barton McLean, who played a mob king in all the films. Ricardo Cortez, who played, not only did he play, I think it was Perry Mason. No, he played Perry Mason in one film. He was like a Latin lover type, but his name was really Jacob Leibowitz from the Lower East Side. And they pawned him off as a replacement for Rudolph Valentino, but he was a regular stock player. And they mix this horror, and you watch these gangsters just scared to death of Karloff, and why wouldn't you be? No. Great little film, another 65-minute film, great atmospherics. Just a perfect melding of two genres without missing a beat. And that's why The Walking Dead sits there as number 3 in my list.
It's a good one. Yeah, I got that one here somewhere too. I like that one quite a bit. In fact, I think one of the gangsters also is appeared in a bunch of Abbott and Costello films later on the following decade. I'm trying to remember which one. It'll come to me. Anyway, my number 3. I had this a little higher, and I pulled it back one because I think what's going to be my number 2 actually is a little bit close to my heart, but I love this film. This is, without a doubt, my favorite Lugosi role. even eclipses Dracula. Of course, I'm talking about White Zombie from 1932.
Yeah.
Murder Legendre, right? Or however he says his
Legendre.
weirdest name ever, right? But this, and again, another one of those films that from this era that like there's almost like no music in it. And it's all about the camera work and the looks on the actors' faces. I mean, you get these like, just they do these great close-ups of Lugosi in this film. It's all about the eyes, and he's just got this like hypnotic power. In fact, I think, he almost does that whole hypnotic power thing better in this film than he does in Dracula, which of course was, the year before. So he had a lot of practice doing this sort of thing. But man, this is, for all intents and purposes, perhaps the first appearance of the Walking Dead in any film, right?
Yep.
And these are, zombies with the big eyes bulging out of their heads. And there's nothing creepier than seeing some of these scenes in this where they are. Again, is this an island? I'm trying to remember if this was like an island somewhere. I think it was.
I think it's
Yeah, I don't remember. And so this voodoo is involved here and all this sort of thing, but he's got like all of these like zombies, or what do they call them? They call them something else here.
Well, they call them zombies.
They did call them zombies. Okay, yeah. And you see them like just walking around in the countryside in the hills, and all of a sudden they're just ambling about. It's not, and these are not like we're going to eat you zombies. These are just like aimlessly walking around until murder, tells them what they need to do. And in fact, there's one scene where one of the zombies is like this African-American dude. He's really tall, and his eyes, you've seen this guy before. He's been in a bunch of films, just literally bulging out of his head, and he's so disturbing looking. And there's this whole subplot. You got these two young lovers who are engaged to be married, and then you've got the kind of the caretaker of the big house that's or the what do you call it, the mansion that's there in this place where we're at. And he like falls in love with the girl, right? So now how do we get rid of the fiance? And then you throw Lugosi's character in there, who of course wants to control all of them. And it's a beastly film that is just so creepy, so ahead of its time, really eerie. I mean, it says it perfectly right here. Leonard Maltin says, eerie, unique, a total chiller. The dead walk among us. I mean, this is like, if you've never seen White Zombie, it is a great film. I can watch this over and over and over again. And the thing is, it's not an action-packed film, but it doesn't need to be. And it's not long. I mean, this also is like, barely over an hour. And it's just creepy and atmospheric. But man, when Lugosi is on camera,
he's magnetic in the film.
He's absolutely magnetic, and I would be scared shit of this guy. If I came face to face with him, I'd be going somewhere else. It's just when he like overtakes the lead female character and puts her under his spell, so to speak, just chilling stuff. Great. And the whole end of the movie is great. The last like 20 minutes, amazing.
Yeah, they used it. The Halpernin brothers were the producers on that film, and they were like with these independent producers. A lot of those sets, even his mansion, I believe, is some of the mansions and sets were from Phantom of the Opera. They would rent the backlot studio stuff, and the interesting thing about White Zombie is the shots of his eyes, the close up of his eyes. They actually did another film in 1936 called Revolt of the Zombies by the Halpernin brothers. Not very good. It's about zombies in Cambodia, or it takes place. It's very strange, but they actually use that close up of his eyes in that film as well, because he's not in Revolt of the Zombies. And that shot had been used numerous times. It became like the stock footage eerie eye look.
Yeah.
But yeah, it moves a little bit slow, but it's really eerie as hell, and it moves slow because it's 1932. They really didn't have anything, down pat with film. They were still kind of static to some extent, 31 to 32. But yeah, it's a great little film. Love it.
Big fan.
Number 2 for me, I'm going to something that you mentioned earlier, The Body Snatcher. Interestingly enough, I'm just going to add a bit of trivia to it about, it's so funny when we talk about Karloff having, chewing up the scenery, so to speak. And it's interesting, Karloff came, the whole thing with The Body Snatcher is that Val Lewton went to, just give a little background on Val Lewton. Val Lewton went to RKO after working under Selznick, after working as a number of years in co-production, went to RKO, and RKO wanted to create a horror division, horror, because the horror films were hot, and they wanted to make them cheap, fast, and make them quick. And that's where the whole dark light and shadow came into play. You have to make great big sets. But Val Lewton, when it comes down to the Body Snatcher, by about after their third film, Karloff had just made House of Frankenstein at Universal. And when he first went back to do House of Frankenstein, they wanted him to play the monster, which he balked. I'm not doing that. So they made him into the mad scientist, or Dr. Neiman. And after he left that film, he left Universal. He says, I'm not making another film there. He says, these films are now becoming a monster clam bake, because they had all these monsters in there. And so he was offered by the production head at RKO to come there. Val Lewton was a little concerned, because here we're bringing a guy who's a horror actor. His films were made on atmosphere and fear of the unknown. They didn't want to bring in a big horror star, now turn him into monster movies. But apparently Val Lewton and Boris Karloff got on so well, to the point they remained close friends until Val Lewton's death in 1951. But also Karloff remembered him very fondly years later in his biography, or when he was being interviewed. Even Sarah Karloff would say that Val Lewton would come to the house for dinner, because they were both intelligent men, well-read men, and so forth. So the thing about it is, he went on there, and the interesting thing about the Body Snatcher is that the last time we did the English show about English horror films, this was the first full-length film directed by Robert Wise, who did The Haunting. And he came on to direct it. Once again, you pretty much nailed it on the head with the Body Snatcher. What it does, it's creepy. You're not going to give too much away from it. But Karloff just loved making the films, The Body Snatcher, Isle of the Dead, and Bedlam.
Bedlam, yeah.
These were the three Val Lewton films. And it actually reinvigorated his career. It actually broke him away from being a monster. Because then they realized, my God, he's playing a crazy general in Isle of the Dead. He's playing this, the Body Snatcher, who actually is kind of interesting, because he does care about the little girl who's crippled, not to give too much away. It's a strange film. There's really no heroes, there's no villains in the Body Snatcher. And then of course he does Bedlam, where he plays even far more evil, as sadistic head of like the nut house. And this kind of reinvigorated Karloff's career. And many people like to say that Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was the ruination of the Hollywood Universal monsters. It wasn't. It was the Monster Rally films that destroyed it. Those last two films that are endearing to us as we were kids, and as I watch them as an adult, I go, what the hell's going on here? And it's kind of a shame. It's fun, but that was a shame. But yeah, Body Snatcher, top notch, everything from atmospherics to suggested murder, death, whatever. Definite see. You have to see it. If you're watching us tonight, you have to see this. And that's my number two.
Yeah, good choice. I like it a bit. Yeah, I mean, as far as House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, they're still fun to watch, but man, consistency, people. I mean,
no continuity.
Come on, no continuity, and just misuse of the monsters, which is the reason why everybody's watching them, right?
Yeah. Well, that's why they brought Lugosi into the Body Snatcher, because there came a producer came on by the name of Jack Gross, who Val Lewton didn't like. Jack Gross, and whereas Val Lewton really took a lot of care into his film and how it's filmed and oversaw the whole thing in an artistic sense, Jack Gross just says, let's get Karloff, we get a scar. And then when they realized we can get Lugosi cheap, no exaggeration, they brought Lugosi in, and Val, goddamn, I forgot his name all of a sudden. Jesus, sorry. Val Lewton, yeah. He ended up writing the part for Lugosi, because they figured two monsters into one. Eventually, the heads at RKO split the production team up at one point of Tournier, the director, who did the Cat People, and Val split them up, figured we could have two guys making horror films at once. They really cheapened the whole product, which the studio does. And sadly enough, but that's how they got Lugosi into the parks. They figured, we'll have the horror men together. And it was also the last teaming of them as in a film, although it's a very minor role.
Yeah, you almost feel bad for Lugosi in that film, right? Because it is a minor role, and he totally plays second fiddle to Carlos' character.
And they said he was rather sick during the production, because what it is, he became addicted to morphine the year before for stomach ulcers. He was going on tour to do Dracula in Summer Stage, whatever, and a doctor suggested he take morphine for his pain, and he ended up becoming addicted to it to the point where it just became embarrassing to him. But they said, apparently Robert Wise said that in a commentary that Karloff, they got on very well, as opposed to when you see in the movie Ed Wood. They got on very well, Karloff and Lugosi, and actually he kind of helped Lugosi along because he knew Lugosi was not well. And but that was their last teaming as well. So Body Snatcher.
Body Snatcher. All right, my number 2, and this, like I said, this moved up a notch just now. I'm a huge fan of this film, and I think this is one of the films in everything that I'm talking about, at least today, that I still can't understand that they haven't like put this out on Blu-ray and upgraded this. And again, it's a Warner Brothers thing. Totally get it, but man, we have got to see the 1932 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Fred McMarch. They've got to do something to put this out in high definition. I'm telling you, it's just screaming for a deluxe edition. And I'm not a big fan of the 1941 with Spencer Tracy. No. I think he was completely miscast. He's a great actor, but not for this role. But man, Frederick March, I mean, this is one scary ass film. What a performance. And again, when one of those movies from this era that is, to me, is just as compelling as Frankenstein and Dracula and The Mummy and, White Zombie and a lot of these other really early 30s films. I mean, it's just so good. And again, everybody knows the story about, Dr. Jekyll has experimented with all this stuff. He comes up with this formula, turns him into the evil Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde starts taking more and more control over the body, whatnot. And he goes on these, what you call benders, right? And he spends a lot of time in the makeup, and he goes out and he, picks up these women, and he's just not a good guy. And he's just like, so it just, you talk about the evil in men always seems to come out, the worst at some point in your life, the worst in a man will come out. Well, here he's been able to, by using chemicals, able to do that. And it's such an amazing film. I've seen it countless times throughout my life. And it's just screaming for an upgrade, a big special deluxe edition. And I when we were getting ready to do this show, I was looking up like all sorts of information. It's like, is there anything out there, any talk of
I'm surprised they haven't put it out. That's kind of a shocker, because
it was a big film. I mean,
that should be a given.
He won an Academy Award for this.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is that they put it on a twofer, and that's the only way to get it. I mean, they show it on Turner every so often, but but it's not an MGM film. It's a Paramount film, I think. And the interesting thing about it is that MGM does not, MGM does not own Paramount. Universal owns Paramount Films. Yeah. Why it's on the MGM 2-disc is thing. And that was another film that for many years, there were key scenes missing. It was heavily edited, and they eventually found the footage. And then to talk about the evil in men, the point where he has this one prostitute he visits all the time, and that he's just beating her and raping her. They don't show it, but she just is horror. She's terrified by it. Yeah. But he's paying good money, but he just takes every animal instinct out on her.
And that's pretty heavy stuff for the time, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was pre-code, so they got away with it. They pushed the envelope in pre-code. Then all of a sudden, people slept in separate beds. You couldn't get away with crimes. You had all criminals had to pay the price at the end. Back in the old days, God, you could rape and pillage and get away with everything and go singing off into the sunset. No, once the code came in, that's when it became extremely sanitized.
Yeah.
We're up to number 1, aren't we?
Number 1, yep.
All right, I'll bet you and I have the same number 1. And I'm going to take a wild shot with this. It's more of an adventure movie. And nothing, and it's the biggest monster of all.
Yep.
King Kong. Is that your number 1 too? Just don't ruin the surprise, right?
I almost was like, I almost wasn't going to pick it because I'm like, all right, it's not really a horror film, but it is. it's more of a monster film. It's a total adventure film. And I'm like, come on, how can you not pick King Kong as your favorite, right? I mean,
I was thinking the same thing you were. I had it. It was at number one. I took it off number one. I put it back to number one. And I'm going, how can I not mention King Kong?
yeah.
And you just have to. I mean, the funny thing about King Kong, we all know the story. I think anybody in the audience that you have tonight has not seen King Kong. You need some kind of medicine or help, because everybody has seen King Kong. As a matter of fact, before I get into the film and why I love it so much, if you come in from the New York area, okay, particularly in the days of the 50s and 60s on television. Now, maybe not in other parts of the country, this is not true, but King Kong in the New York market is synonymous with Thanksgiving. Channel 9, I believe, in New York City would play King Kong, Son of Kong, and Mighty Joe Young on Thanksgiving Day. And that was the only time you could see it.
Yeah.
To this day, where I will watch King Kong. Screw the parade. I'm watching King Kong, and I even have a King Kong tie that I wear at Thanksgiving dinner. I mean, it sounds kind of nerdy and stupid, but it's a great way to mess with people, because they'll say, "Why do you have a King Kong tie on?" It says, "You are not worthy to know." And that's it.
You
But
must not be from New York, right? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, King Kong still holds up. And I think about it. You watch it, yes, it's antiquated to some extent. I mean, the split screen, the glass mats in the back, it's just flawless, except for King Kong's fur moving, which it doesn't bother you when he moves the character. I mean, the only way I could reckon how exciting King Kong was to see it, because from the time Willis O'Brien did The Lost World till he did King Kong, he had gone light years with the stop motion.
Oh yeah.
To the point, and they had it down to a science. And it's the only way I could explain how exciting King Kong must have been to people. And I think Rich Catano would agree with this also. He likes dinosaurs. Is that when Jurassic Park came out, the CGI of the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, with the skin textures and the lighting, it was breakthrough. So you have to really think that back in 1933, it was just as breakthrough. But the funny thing about King Kong, it still holds up.
Yeah.
You can watch it from beginning to end. You're not bored. It's I like the Peter Jackson remake to a degree, to an extent, and I appreciate Peter Jackson's love of the film. But the one thing that's always bothered, I have to say this, the one thing that's bothered me about the remake is that whereas Robert Armstrong was Carl Denham, says his lines, but he still has this kind of I'm a William Castle type, promoter type thing. Every famous line that's from the original film, when Jack Black recites it in the movie, King Kong from Peter Jackson, it sounds like he's trying to do Othello. He just goes over the top with it. And that's the great thing about Kong. Once again, Fay Wray.
Yeah.
Now, one last bit of trivia about it that's very interesting to know in the world of film is that the fellow who plays the chieftain on the island of the natives, okay, is an actor by the name of Noble Johnson. Noble Johnson not only appears in The Mummy with Boris Karloff, he plays his manservant in some very small roles in it.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, basically, JC just started. He also plays, you ever watched The Most Dangerous Game from 1932? He plays Count Zaroff's dog handler. But the most interesting thing about Noble Johnson in the world of cinema is that Noble Johnson and his brother founded the first African-American film production company in 1915 called Lincoln Motion Pictures. Who knows why it failed? We can only imagine a number of reasons. None of the films exist, but he was actually a well-written, well-read, well-rounded artistic individual across the board. And of course, he got relegated to certain roles, and some of the roles he's been in, everybody knows him. But his history is far more richer than people think. And I just wanted to share that with people that like old films. But that's who he is. So King Kong gets no better than that.
Yeah. And shout out to Most Dangerous Game, because that's a very good film, and I didn't consider it for this, but
played on the same sets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of the same sets.
Max Steiner music, the whole thing. It was like a back-to-back thing. And of course, they burned the wall of King Kong's wall For Gone with the Wind.
Yeah,
Exactly. They burned down.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, King Kong is an absolute classic. I've been watching. There's like a handful of films that I've probably seen more than any other in my life, and it's definitely in the top five. That and King Kong versus Godzilla, Godzilla versus King Kong. I mean, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, King Kong, Godzilla versus Kong. Uh, these movies that played all the time on the holidays, Son of Kong, Mighty Joe Young, and it was a staple in my house from when I was a little kid. I mean, I was probably 3, 4 years old watching King Kong, and it thrilled me just as much back then as it does now. I agree with you 100%. I think the stop motion photography effects from Willis O'Brien leagues better in this than The Lost World, which for the time was pretty cool, but man, it's like night and day. I mean, that battle scene between Kong and the T-Rex is one of the greatest, you know? And you can tell they put money into this film, and the acting is great, and Fay Wray is awesome in it. And it's an exciting, edge of your seat adventure film, whether you've seen it 50 times, 100 times, or you've never seen it at all and you're watching it for the first time. You're literally on. They don't make films like that anymore.
I
They
mean, the
really
whole sequence on the log sequence, where
do.
they fall down. Then you have the lost sequence of the spider pit, which got cut out.
Yeah,
But just the whole thing of being on the log and where they're running, the music is just panic.
yeah.
And it's just, these guys go in there. Now, a bit of funny trivia about King Kong. I always tell this to people when I talk about the movie. You think about things, why do they do things in the movies that they do? So why did they build the wall for King Kong? Why? To keep him out, right? So why did they make a door he could walk through? Why did they just make a little tiny door? We'll bring the sacrifice in, we lock the door, see it.
Yeah.
No, they turn around, he makes a door that he's big enough to walk through. Serves no purpose.
Right.
So,
Unless you know that someday you're going to want him to walk through that door, right?
oh yeah, and on top of that, if that door did not exist, we wouldn't have a movie. So there you go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Totally makes sense. And this is the Blu-ray, which came out probably about maybe a decade ago. They have not reissued this since, and this is pretty hard to come by. So
Is it really? I didn't know that. I bought
yeah.
the DVD set that had like two things on it with all the supplemental. I didn't know that, really. I didn't know that they had put it out on the. It's
Yeah.
wow.
It's like a book, like one of those book sets. So
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's yes. Okay. North by Northwest, I have one like that. All Quiet on the Western Front. Okay. Yes. That were those special collector's editions.
yeah,
Yes.
they didn't make a lot of them, but very, very cool. Yeah, because originally they had the DVD box set, which had this Son of Kong and Mighty Joe Young with all
Yeah,
that bonus stuff, which is a really
King
good.
Kong was like a 2-disc set on
Yeah.
that too. That's the one that I had.
Yeah. So, but a great film, and I like the Peter Jackson film quite a bit. It's a little bit different. The De Laurentiis film from the 70s has its moments. It's kind of cheesy, but
It's King Kong. It's hard to,
yeah, yeah. But that had to be my number one. I kept trying to convince myself that I shouldn't put it on this list, and I was like, nah, it's got to be.
That's how I was torn. I didn't know what to do, and I sat there and went, I cannot leave this film out.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I mean, and if I do leave it in, well, it's got to be number one. If I put it at number 9, someone's going to say, why is it number 9? So it's number 1.
Got
it. Of course, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to.
Any honorable mentions you want to rattle off?
Oh yeah. The Black Room from 1935 with Karloff playing twin brothers. Remember that one? Another Halperin brothers film from 1933 under Paramount called Supernatural, about a woman being possessed by the spirit of an executed murderess. And the woman is played by Carol Lombard, who eventually went off and married Clark Gable, was a big comedian star, one of the biggest stars in 30s and 40s, who died in 1942 in a plane crash selling war bonds. And also has Randolph Scott, who later on, always rumored to be Cary Grant's boyfriend, but no, he went a career of because they lived together for a year and a half in Hollywood, but also became a Western star. A film that's not a horror film, but it's a real rarity, and you can find it on YouTube. 1934, it's called The Ninth Guest. It's a Columbia picture, and it basically is, and then there were none, or 10 Little Indians, Agatha Christie, takes place in a penthouse, an Art Deco penthouse. Interesting about it, people said, well, that's just Agatha Christie's story. No, this was made 5 years before Agatha Christie wrote the book. So it makes you wonder. That's some of the 3 or 4. And Black Moon, 1934 voodoo film with Jack Holt from Columbia,
Wow.
which was lost for many years. It's not a barn burner. It has that slow move to it. And without even going through the titles, any Val Lewton film is worthy of the list. So that covers all my honorable mentions. And I just like to show something to people tonight that I have in my collection, since I rarely bring toys. But if anybody is into horror, there's a book that came out in 1966 called, you can see it, there it is, Horror, by a writer named Drake Douglas. And this is a 1969 pressing, which has like this psychedelic black light Lon Chaney on there. But it's a really go-to book that you could find inexpensively on a reprinting of it called Horrors, that covers all of the genres in the motion picture of horror and gives a really atmospheric opening, kind of like Return of the Vampire and, this atmospheric opening. And then he goes into the history of all the films in the genre. And as a kid, this is how in the 60s, how I learned about some of the things from Return of the Vampire, from some of the other films. And it's a worthwhile read. You could find it online on the reprinting of it for as little as like $10, $12 for a hardcover. If you want to get the vintage original one, sometimes original pressings of it goes a little like less than 40 or 50. And this one here you could find inexpensively, which is the 1969 version. But it's a worthwhile read. Anybody's into horror films, you should get this. In particular, the updated version, it has over like 72 photographs. So worthwhile trivia thing.
Yeah, there's so many cool horror books out there. It's crazy. I have a ton of them. All right, let's see. Honorable mentions for me. I did want to mention Cat People, Val Lewton, 1942. That's quite good. The Devil Bat from 1940, another Lugosi classic. That's it's not the most sophisticated story, but I still think it's pretty cool. It's a great role for him, about how he creates these giant bats, right, to go out and do his bidding and get revenge. It's more like a revenge flick than anything else, right? Pretty cool. Yeah. Dr. Cyclops from 1940.
Albert Decker, yes.
Yeah, that's again, that's kind of like King Kong. It's more of like a kind of like adventure type of film, but it's got its horror sci-fi elements, I think.
Great miniature, ahead of its time, special effects at that time.
Yeah, big time. Yep, exactly. The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1945. That's a classic tale, good film. The Undying Monster from 1942, another pretty good one. And then last but not least, again, not really a horror film, but I'm a big fan of it, and I think it's another great Lugosi performance, Chandu the Magician.
A lot of fun. Yes. Yeah. The movie, not the serial, the movie with Edmund Lowe, and he plays Roxor, the evil. Yeah. That's a good one.
That's another chewing up the scenes, and every time Lugosi is on camera, you just can't take your eyes off of him.
It's a great one too, with Mask of Fu Manchu. As politically incorrect as it is, it's over the top.
I love it. I'm a big fan.
And that was another film you never saw on television. You see the pictures in Famous Monsters of Filmland and going like, wow. And it was so funny. At one point in time, there's a famous shot in the Mask of Fu Manchu where they have, I think it's Nayland Smith, is played by Louis Stone, who played Judge Hardy in the Andy Hardy films. And Fu Manchu has this wall with the spikes coming in, and they had, there he goes, and I mean, incestual, over the top, his daughter, I mean, Myrna Loy, it's hard to believe she's the Thin Man's wife. I mean, she's just, it's insane. But anyhow, they have like Louis Stone, who's a thinner actor, playing like Nayland Smith, and Gene Herschelt, who was also in Mark of the Vampire. He's much heavier set, and as they were making the movie, they said, get Louis Stone out of there. Put Gene Herschelt in there. It's better to watch the fat guy sweat in the spikes. And they put him in there. But no, that's another. There's just so many. I mean, I like all from those days.
It's funny. I actually like the Fu Manchu films. You got what did Karloff do? 4 of them, right? Something like that.
Did he? No, Christopher Lee did a number.
Oh, Christopher. Karloff, yeah. You know what? Yeah, Karloff only did what? 2 of them?
No, well, he did 1.
So he just did the one. So Christopher Lee did 4 or 5. I'm trying to remember.
He did 5 of them. He did three at Hammer, and then he did 2 with the director Jess Franco, who's kind of like an who also did the 1970 Dracula with Christopher Lee, and Klaus Kinski, who actually ate real flies in the film to do the realism, and he was nuttier than a fruitcake anyhow, so it didn't matter. But he only made the one. But he
was good. Karloff's over the top of that.
But Karloff played Asians in a number of films. I mean, West of Shanghai. He played Mr. Wong, detective.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
He played it a number of times. But yeah, Fu Manchu, no one-shot deal. Warner Oland, who played Charlie Chan, made 3 Fu Manchu films in 1929, 30, and 31, and they were very successful. And as a matter of fact, interesting thing about those films, once again, there's a big thing about, which I understand, is it's about Asians not being portrayed by Asian Americans in films. But apparently, what's his name? Hugh Hefner from Playboy. He had a massive movie collection, big, and he was famous for showing movies at his house. He underwrote the Sherlock Holmes films, Basil Rathbone. He underwrote the restoration of those. He also underwrote the restoration of the 3 Fu Manchu films from Warner Oland, but they have not seen the light of day. They're sitting in UCLA. They are out there, in like somewhat better prints. The third one is out there in a good print, but yeah, it was Warner Oland that played Fu Manchu.
Okay. Then wasn't he also in Werewolf of London?
He played Professor Yogami.
That's right. Yep.
Now, speaking of another honorable mention, not to drag it out here anymore, he plays. There's a film that came out in 1933 called Before Dawn, which is about some guy that dies in a hospital. He tells this benevolent doctor, who's played by Warner Oland, about money, that he was involved with a big robbery and the money that's kept in a house, and it's these people trying to get the money after he dies. Dark house thriller type thing. Very fond of those. So
cool.
There you go.
Yeah, so many good ones. So there you have it, everybody. So our 10 favorites and some honorable mentions from cool old horror classics from the 30s and 40s, the golden age, I guess you could call it, right? So non-universal. So for those watching, if you want to contribute in the comments below, list your 5 or 10 favorite 30s and 40s non-universal horror films, right? That's what we're kind of going for here. And if you haven't caught it, Dan and I did, a few months back, we did our 10 we did this whole same thing, but we picked our favorite Universal films. That was a few months back. So if you want to go check that out and find out which of the Universal films from this time period we picked, go investigate that before or after you watch this one. And this is all the non-Universal stuff. So thanks for watching, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on YouTube all the damn times. Tune in next week, Thursday night, for another edition of the Monsters Den. We've got our 3rd and final part of our look at the film Spookies. This time we've got a couple actors from the film who will be joining us talking about their experiences filming the film Spookies. So stay tuned for that next week, and then more stuff to come. So for Dan Brown, I am Pete Pardo. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.